So there I was living my sad and ignorant life thinking, wow, the French are really only good at eating snails and making foul-tasting salad dressing, and along comes Clair Obscur, Expedition 33, to say that, hey, it's not just the countries of the Axis powers that make good turn-based RPGs, but also the Allied powers too. So I'd like to get the obvious out of the way first and just start by saying that Expedition 33 is a very solid JRPG, FRPG, I don't know, whatever, but it's made by developers whose love for the genre as a whole can really be felt throughout the entirety of the game. The story is pretty good, I'm just going to say that right out of the gate, and you can tell which JRPGs the developers were most inspired by, most notably Nier Replicant, Final Fantasy, especially 10 and Type 0, Lost Odyssey, Shadow Hearts, and maybe even a little bit of inspiration from the French RPG Greedfall as well. So in a wide aperture, yes, I would say the game is very good, but there's definitely a few choices that kind of bring the game overall down a bit. Chiefly, the way the game handles the new guy's inclusion to the party is one of the larger missteps in the game. Narratively, it just immediately disconnects you as the player and your investment with the goals of the initial party, and Verso obviously knows more than you do as the player, so having to play as him during the camp sequences doesn't really work because previously both you and Gustav had the same objective and the same knowledge, and clearly Verso knows a lot more than he's letting on, and you're never certain if his objective is the same or if he's just straight lying. So in that sense, I feel like playing as Mael would have made a lot more sense narratively, but then I guess that would kind of negate the need for having the Persona tier social link scenes. Anyway, I did like the character writing overall because each character felt a lot more realistic than most modern games or most modern media portrays, with each character having actual faults and depth to them without being cheap agitprop that most of these publishers try to get away with. And on the flip side, you do end up hating the main villain, which is always a good sign of good storytelling in fiction. I'll just quickly say that the game looks great even on console, and the whole game kind of feels earthy and grimy, and we even see that manifest as caked dirt and blood on the characters' faces throughout the game. I think both the music and sound design are excellent, with Expedition 33 having a diverse soundtrack ranging from these moving vocal and operatic tracks to modern electronic music, but I definitely could see the argument that the soundtrack might be overall a little too eclectic. Now let's talk about the gameplay, because that's the meat and potatoes here. I mean, this is a turn-based RPG with a pretty impressive amount of customization for each party member that allows for a large amount of some insane combinations. So whether you like experimenting with different builds or rather just stick with what has already worked before, ultimately the combat allows for player expression, which is a breath of fresh air. But while the combat is fun, it definitely can be annoying with some really bizarre attack telegraphing from enemies that there's a lot of this, haha, I'm not hitting you just quite yet, and there's sort of fake outs that are just purely trial and error, which gets to be grating after a while. And I realize that this might be a controversial opinion, but giving an enemy 4, 5, 6 or more turns before you can get off one of your own really isn't a challenge, it's just bad game design and choice. And I said a very similar thing when I reviewed Metaphor ReFantazio last year. For most of the game, it is pretty linear, but that's not really a bad thing. The game really doesn't open up until the very end when SKA gains the flight ability, so on one hand, it does keep the narrative pretty tight and focused, and you're not really in danger of going astray or getting lost, but on the other hand, it really does sort of open up a little bit too much and it feels bloated. And as I have been alluding to during this entire review, I think the endgame in Expedition 33 is overall kind of weak. I personally am not a fan of rehashed areas, as I think I've made clear in several of my review videos by now, and I also think it's kind of a letdown that the entire game builds on you confronting and fighting these massive paintress in some sort of Shadow of the Colossus style showdown, only for you to fight the small version of her instead. As a side note, if you're interested in game development, Expedition 33 has a really interesting history, starting off as a tech demo essentially called We Lost in 2019, that later led to connections with Epic Games of all developers, having received seed money from them under Project W, and this game even has connections with the Sonic the Hedgehog movies. Anyway, getting to the end here, I think that I should say, as an American who once took a French literature course, I annoyed the instructor when I told him that I found that French fiction, which this game is, really kind of belabors the point sometimes and in a very unsatisfying manner. So similarly here, I can definitely sympathize with some players' criticism that the story might be lacking in a way that a lot of French fiction does, in that there's really no good or better ending, there's no satisfying conclusion, and the time it takes to get to the end, you might not even care at all. So as we continue to drift through a sea of mediocrity in gaming, good games like Expedition 33 are going to stand out because of their quality and presentation. If you don't like parry mechanics or especially turn-based RPGs, you're probably not going to have a fun time with most of the game, and especially during that third act, but I definitely can see that players who are not as enthralled with RPGs to still find that the game is quite enjoyable, simply because it does have an intriguing storyline, the music is good, it has cool visuals, so Expedition 33 is a game well worth playing. Clair Obscur Expedition 33 earns an A/A-, and it is my personal game of the year, and I think that it will be chalk for the upcoming Game Awards just a few days away.